Chapter 12. The Dead Zone. Nearly 30 minutes had gone by since the small ST had lost contact with the generals. The two men were now left alone with Hope, who was guiding them the best she could. The fog and clouds began to clear, and they had started to see them. The enormous mountain range that reached from the ground to the edge. As Leon got a closer look, he saw that the skies were peeling apart, and the clouds were being sucked up by the edge and the two moons. The mountain's peak that pierced the atmosphere disappeared into the darkness, and only the two moons continued to shine through just over the top of them. Leon continued to stare into the mysterious sky, wondering why the moons were unfazed by the edge which surrounded them. Hope interjected into his conscience and gave him the answer that he had been seeking. The moons are the typical moons as one would expect. According to a conversation that was held long ago, the moons are the energy the gods have put towards the expansion of the universe. In layman's terms, they are the tip of the spear that continues to cut through the nothingness and continue to expand our universe. The moons are essentially the heart of the universe and keep it going forward by pumping matter and life into it. Leon began to think about what he had just heard, decided at this point it didn't matter what he had expected, but rather what mattered is what the truth was. What is true, though at times may seem illogical, was no more preposterous than where he was now. It didn't matter that he had never been prepared for any of this. This was now his reality. This was now his truth. The same could be said for any new discoveries in science. Just because at one point something was undefined or unknown, it didn't make it any less real or logical after it was studied and verified. As humans grasped a better understanding of things around them, more possibilities and information was always brought to light. The transport started to descend as it began landing roughly 50 yards away from the mountain face entrance. As the transport lowered, the full scope of the giant rock face could be recognized. Neither Leon nor Vance could see much further than a few miles up it. Both of them continued peering up at the edge for a bit, inspecting the total void of nothingness, but eventually they gave up. The enormous moons were now partially hidden behind the mountain face as the ST lowered onto the desert floor. The closer they got to the ground, the less of a difference either of them could make between the night sky and the edge, as it all blended together. There doesn't seem to be any irregularities on this side of the mountain entrance, Hope alerted them as the ST finally came to a halt. The back hatch opened, and both Vance and Leon grabbed their packs from the storage compartments. Leon barged in front of Vance to stop him from walking outside before him. "Try and keep up, old man," Leon said, smiling back. Vance furrowed his brows and smiled back. Together, the two of them stepped out into the sandy wasteland, with Hope following beside them. The shadow of the colossal mountain that had already encompassed them long ago became all that much more real once they were outside. It could be for that very reason why they hadn't seen any signs of the expansion into this area. It wasn't just barren, it was devoid of all and any life. In the surrounding space, there was little more than sand, dust, and bones. The only sound that could be heard was the whistling of the wind as it rushed through the small dark crevasse opening in the mountainside. The back hatch of the ST closed behind them, and Vance swung his pack over his shoulders. "Let's go," he said, as he began to move forward towards the task in front of them. "Well, this ought to be fun," Leon said, mimicking Vance as he and Hope followed. The group continued forward as the two men tried to ignore any lingering anxiety that they had in the back of their minds. As they walked forward across the desert floor, the soft sleekness of each grain of sand was felt beneath their boots as a gust of wind lifted multiple grains up that pelted Vance. He felt nearly every pellet to some degree, as Hope was conserving every bit of energy that she could for not if, but when they ran into trouble. Vance wasn't too worried about this, as he was used to being outside in rough conditions before the idea of Hope had ever crossed his mind. The glasses that she had told him to wear also found their purpose as they helped to stop the grains from blinding him. For Leon, things were much more straightforward. Every grain of sand that came into contact with him would simply bounce off or dissolve on contact. "Be ready for anything once we get inside," Vance told Leon as they were almost to the entrance. "Even if things look deserted, stay on alert, and if you see anything, let me know. We may get lucky and not have to deal with anything until we get inside of the dead zone. Still, given everything we've seen, that's highly unlikely. Even if they haven't set up base here, knowing that they've expanded this way doesn't bode well for us." "I wasn't planning on being caught," Leon said, thinking back to what he saw before. "I guess the only solace is that if we are caught due to our conquest rings, the torture probably won't last too long and our souls will be devoured by one of the dark gods." "That may be true for you, kid, but for me it may not be so simple," Vance responded. They both made it to the entrance together near the cave opening. There was a beaten and battered sign that read, "Step inside to receive thy everlasting time of gloom and pain. Come, ye, to see who awaits." "Gloom and pain, huh?" Vance said. "Seems about right to me. You ready, kid?" Part 2. Inside, it was pitch black with no signs of life. The one apparent thing was an overwhelming smell that made each of them gag upon entry. If not for the open nature of how the mountain tunnels were laid out, that smell of mold and disgust could have easily knocked them both over. "What's that awful smell?" Leon asked, covering his nose and mouth, looking forward into the pitch black. "No idea, but I'm guessing we'll find out soon enough," Vance said while searching his pack. "I guess we're going to do this old school," he smiled, and he pulled out a torch and stepped inside a bit further to shelter himself from the wind. He clicked his lighter twice as the sparks created the flame he needed to get the torch started. Vance then held it out in front of him, and it was apparent from what he could see that this entrance hadn't been disturbed for quite some time. In all honesty, it probably wasn't touched since the last time someone was called from Salutis to claim an item from Fate. There were cobwebs everywhere, with no traces of much else besides the rock, mold, and that wretched stench that could sting their nostrils. Leon took out his torch from his pack, and with the spark from his fingers, set it ablaze. "Show off," Vance said, as he pushed forward. His torch cut through the webs quickly as he progressed. Leon followed behind, and soon the dry sand that they had been walking through had slowly transitioned into a muddy, rocky slosh. As they moved ahead, there still wasn't much of anything new. The rock faces changed occasionally, and the jagged edges came in different shapes and sizes, trying to slow them down. Still, other than the occasional water drip from the side wall, everything was mostly the same. The most notable change was that god-forsaken stench that went from a wretched stink to a now almost unbearable wave of death. By this point, Vance had wrapped his scarf around his face, and Leon had done the same with his hoodie, holding it in place with the pull straps. "What's that smell, Hope?" Leon asked her as he continued to look around, not noticing anything out of the ordinary. "Honestly, I'm not completely sure," she said, while she was busily inspecting a nearby rock that had a faint glimmer to it. Her scanners on Leon's bracelet, examining everything as they made their way in deeper. Apparently, it wasn't too impressive as she turned and continued forward to where Leon was. "There is a bunch of iron in the air, along with methane. The source seems to be coming from all around us. It's particularly intense from the mud you are walking through, and what I can discern for you is very limited due to the different readings coming from all the different sources. There was now a slight sound of flowing water further up ahead, along with a faint light. If I had to guess, she tried to continue, but was interrupted by Vance. Douse your torch now! Leon followed Vance's lead and plunged his torch into the thick mud. But before he did, he took notice of the bare human footprints and dried blood spatter that riddled the nearby walls. If that sign near the entrance wasn't a heads up before, it was now clear that they weren't alone. With the small light up ahead, Leon could just make out what Vance was doing. Vance was holding his hands up, as if to tell Leon to wait. As he stood there, the two of them listened to what sounded like a faint whispering ahead. Unfortunately, with the running water, they were unable to make anything out at this distance. Slowly, they moved towards the light ahead. After they had made it about 20 paces forward, Hope had instructed them to wait where they were. This is all very wrong, she told them, as the whispering continued. The dead zone entrance is supposed to be up ahead at the inner cave, but there aren't many of the normal signs that you would expect for it. The celestial energies at this point are much lower than recorded, and I'm even getting a small reading of dark energies. Well, whatever gave you the idea something was wrong? Vance whispered sarcastically as he continued to observe the things in front of him. Hope just ignored him and continued watching the situation around them the best she could. Can you amplify my hearing, Hope? It could give us an idea of what is going on. Very well. Give me just a moment. Everything for Leon was amplified in an instant. Both his vision and hearing were heightened instantly, and as soon as it did, all he heard were sobs, along with two other people talking. Shut up, girl, the man said, shortly after Leon heard the sound of someone being slapped. Can I play? A morph voice asked. Not with this one. I've come to collect the witch, as she has a vital role to play on her own. Though since you caught her, I've brought you 3 fun new play toys for you to play with at your pleasure. Someone snapped their fingers, and the sounds of chains could be heard grinding together, approaching the voice of the man. We've got to get a better look at the situation, Leon whispered to Vance, who at this point was entirely out of the loop. They pressed forward, eventually reaching a corner of the entrance to the inner chamber. Vance could now hear everything as well. We'll be on our way. Have fun with your prey. Playtime. The man laughed, as 3 different men were heard begging to be spared. Valentine, don't forget the rules, a different man could be heard saying, while snickering at the men begging. All right, forgive me. The rules are simple, you 3. If you can escape the cave before you're all caught, he will not follow you outside. So here we go. On your marks. The keys turned and the chains dropped. Go, he said, laughing, while walking away. Leon saw him as he peeked around the corner. It was a tall, stocky man, about the size of Vance but a bit taller, in a frilly red suit with blonde hair and blue eyes. He was touting a cane made of a baby's skull as the handle, and was walking away with a girl who was still sobbing. Her mouth was gagged with a cloth as she remained in their grasp. Leon grabbed his knife, and it began to spark. He was just about to toss it when Vance caught his arm to prevent him from throwing it. What are you trying to do, dumbass? We can't just let them take her like that. You have no fucking clue who that was. And more to the point, just take a look in front of you now, Vance said, motioning Leon to the little island surrounded by a waterfall that came from a 60-foot-high ceiling. The 3 men before began running. One was headed straight for Leon and Vance. Splash, splosh, splash, splosh. He ran through the tainted waters towards them. From within, a figure came out screaming, "Playtime!" Its arms were long and dark, almost bone, with only a tightly thin layer of skin on them. Its fingers were sleek and elongated, all the same length that made it look like a frog's hand, but without the inner webbing. Its wings were gray and tattered, and its face almost looked human, but big and distorted, with enormous flat teeth and pitch-black eyes. It had been covered in blood, and was smiling with a dopey grin. It looked like an incestuous creature that was made only to kill. It flew out in an instant, grabbing the man furthest away from Vance and Leon, crushing his head, and tossing his body to the inside of the little aisle. It quickly headed towards the second man, who was near Vance and Leon. The man had just stepped inside of the pathway and made eye contact with Leon just as the creature grabbed the man. It flung him around and laughed up and down across the walls, dragging him under the water and nearby on the other side of the cave wall from Vance and Leon as it fluttered above. The creature lifted him up by his leg, noticing that the man was already dead. It frowned like a toddler and tossed him back into the center with the rest of his toys, before heading down another tunnel after the final man. What in the hell was that? I'm not positive, but I think it was a fairy tainted by the dark gods. Something has definitely happened for a fairy to be outside of the dead zone. It's possible that the dead zone has at the very least shrunken in size. It seemed more like a guard dog at this point than anything else, Vance retorted. Well, what's the plan then? We gotta move quickly, whatever it is, Leon said, knowing very well as soon as the guy was caught, it was likely that he would return to his toy box, blocking their path. Valentine said that girl was a witch, right? Wasn't it likely that she was here to escort us until she ran into that thing and was handed over? Just what the hell is going on here? I can't understand one single thing that's going on. Why is Valentine here? We were already headed into this blind, but it's more like we're blind and deaf. A loud thump was heard in the middle of the aisle, followed by a strong breeze that came from the cavern beside Leon and Vance. "You'll play?" the fairy asked, looking around the corner at them, staring with a simple-minded grin. Part 3. Leon froze at the sight of the creature who had caught them off guard. Its presence was just as awful, and perhaps even worse than that of the Guardians due to the overpowering smell that engulfed it and the cave. How could a fairy be turned into this? Leon thought to himself. While he was stuck pondering, the creature pounced at him immediately, leading Vance to push him out of the way, and through the opening to the center room. Unable to dodge himself, Vance caught its hand and was slid quickly back through the muddy grime and into the wall. The impact hurt, but he was able to hold the creature off once he had a solid backing behind him. This seemed to do nothing more than amuse the fairy. While Vance's hands were pretty big as far as the humans were concerned, they were only about 1/3 the size of the fairy's. Its eyes had widened, and a more wicked grin neither had seen from it previously rushed upon its face. "You can play, you can play, you can play!" It roared with excitement as Vance pushed its hand aside and quickly regrouped with Leon. "Wake the hell up, kid. Now isn't the time to freeze," Vance said to Leon, helping him up from the blood-stained waters he found himself in. "And what the fucking hell are you so excited for?" he said, looking at the creature that just stood there smiling at him. Its hands were slowly sliding down its face, and if it had nails, surely would have cut deeply into it. "Well, if I had to guess, it's because you were able to react to its movements. If this thing is indeed looking for entertainment, then it was probably getting quite bored of winning so easily." "Ah, best not to disappoint it and let it win then. You ready yet, kid?" Vance asked Leon, while his full attention was focused on the monstrous fairy in front of them. still peeking at them through its fingers. Ready or not, that didn't matter, as here it came. "Watch out, it's about to strike," Hope warned, alerting both of them while using the processes of Leon's fragment to determine that while conserving the power of Vance's. Vance had seemed to intrigue the creature, and its right arm snapped at him like a snake. He was able to avoid it now with the help of Hope, who had done more than just provide an energy shield to soften the blow from earlier. Hope had heightened his senses and his reflexes, while also enhancing his muscles slightly. Though it took everything, Vance was able to catch its arm as it flew past him. Using that inertia, along with his own strength, he was able to fling it towards the center of the room. The creature spun a few times and let out a burst of ridiculous wild laughter as it stopped midair just short of the center. A burst of light came from the center of the waterfall aisle. One of the fairy's toys came to life again and tried to escape once more. It quickly leaped over to the girl who only just walked out of the center aisle. "You no fun," the fairy said. "Go back sleep. I'm playing with no fun toys." Before either of them could react, it reached up with its thick, slimy hand and slammed it down on her in a way that was reminiscent of swatting a pesky mosquito. It slapped her mangled body back inside of its toy box and licked its hand. Blood and saliva covered its disturbing smile, and it turned its attention back to the two in front of it. Watching that happen dragged Leon fully back to his senses. Again, someone else had gotten hurt, and he just stood by, unable to do anything about it. "God damn it, what am I doing?" Leon tossed his pack to a nearby rock and drew his dagger. Afterward, he immediately rushed to the right. The water splashed around him, and the fairy watched him with one eye, the other stayed focused on Vance. "Well, it's not much of a plan, but I like the spirit. All right then, let's do this." "Get ready," Hope told the both of them while projecting in the middle of the water. "Fairies are quite resilient creatures on their own, and there's no telling what this one is fully capable of after being so twisted. On three, charge together. 1." Leon slid to a stop while Vance took out a pair of impervious metal knuckles from his pack that had suns on each of them representing Salutis. 2. Leon began to transfer energy into the dagger, leading it to spark. Vance threw his pack aside near the outer cavern where they had come from. 3. Part 4. They both rushed the ferry at the exact same time. Leon, who was a bit further out, was still able to reach where it was much faster than Vance, who wasn't nearly as agile. "Not so fast!" Hope yelled, trying to warn Leon, who was only a few feet away at this point. The fairy let out a shriek with both of its eyes now focused on Leon. It turned its head sideways like a crazed bird and flew directly at him, shrieking the whole time. Its loud cry forced him to his knees as he covered his ears. Hope was able to muffle the sound quickly after, but it was already too late. The fairy grabbed Leon's head with its slimy hand and squeezed. Even with the double layer of protection he had from his conquest and Hope's shielding technology, it still felt like he was going to be crushed as easily as aluminum in a vice. The electrical field that he had surrounded himself in didn't seem to bother the fairy one bit, as it continued to squeeze him more. The slime upon its thick, disgusting hands seemed to have insulated it from any discharge that would have forced it off of him. At the same time, it prevented Leon from getting any air. "I can't breathe," he mumbled while trying to gasp for air. "What you say?" the fairy asked, continuing to flutter there, squeezing and smiling at Leon gleefully. At this point, Vance had finally caught up to them and charged ahead, jumping up on the fairy's back, climbing its wings. He continued climbing up, pulling and tearing the tattered wings away from it with each grip as he ascended. This caused the deformed creature to swirl round in a panic, tossing Leon into a nearby rocky pillar. Both Leon and the fairy along with Vance fell into the water. Even through all of this, Vance was still clinging to its back like a bull rider. After they were down, he quickly reached the fairy's neck and began squeezing as he tried to choke it out. In most cases, this would have seemed practical, but instead gave it time to recover, and with its long arms it reached towards Vance. Leon, still a bit dazed and winded, staggered up to his knees and began coughing and throwing up what amounted to sewage water. Ahead, he could see what was about to happen, and with the utmost focus, he threw his dagger at full strength. It soared through the air like an electric bullet, hitting the fairy at the base of its wings. Its body was pierced, and only the hilt remained visible. The fairy let out a chilling scream. Now on its knees, Vance jumped off its back and began to rapidly hammer the dagger into its body. He continued pounding, using his fists like sledgehammers. Punch after punch, he began to force the fairy to crawl back into a nearby corner. He wrapped around to its front using such exquisite footwork that there was barely any splashing from the water around him. The dagger, still in its back, continued to burn as Vance was focused on the creature's front. The fairy cried out in what seemed like agony, but soon turned to a deep laughter. Leon had recovered enough at this point and got to his feet. He felt an ill sensation as he ran towards the two of them. There was something off about the fairy now that forced Vance to immediately jump back a few feet, keeping his distance. "Is that fear I sense from you?" The fairy spoke in a completely different, clear, articulate manner. "Ah, it is," it said, looking at Vance, who was now sweating. A look of absolute despair was in his eyes. "Options, now, Hope. Find where we can escape to fast," Vance demanded. Leon noticed that even she seemed a bit unsettled and panicked by the creature. "You two did well to cause what little damage to this creature as you have. But tell me, why is it that you humans continue to resist instead of giving in to the natural order? I find it interesting that there are still some of you that prefer society and the social aspects of your nature over the beauty of your beastly desires. Perhaps it is the fear of not being in the upper echelon in this world that scares most of you. I suppose it matters not. Soon enough I'll wipe this world of those of you who wish to fight against the progression of this universe. Just as your gods have fallen to the brink of extinction, so too will all resistance to my rule." The fairy became lax and rubbed its head, unaware of what had just happened. It looked around with a blank stare on its face, its eyes slowly coming back into focus. "His presence is gone," Hope told Vance and Leon. "Whose presence? What was that?" Leon wondered. His mind was racing and his head still pounded, but he was quite lucid. Without even realizing it, his body had released tons of adrenaline. It didn't matter if it was innate fear that led to this, he was now fully ready to fight. "Be careful, what is coming is much different from what you have seen previously," Hope warned them, sensing a change in the fairy. The fairy's eyes were now in focus, and continued to look for a moment, but must have decided it was best not to think about its short blackout. "You play well, no more play for fun, now I play for win," the fairy said happily, with no worries at all on its mind. All that mattered to it now was winning the game. Hope tried to warn the two men, but the fairy charged at them too quickly for her to warn. It was fast, too fast. Leon was just able to dodge it thanks to his body now being in a heightened state of fight or flight. While Vance had been fighting this way the entire time due to his conquest, that alone wasn't enough. He was sent flying across the full length of the inner cavern and slammed into the far wall. While his shield did take the brunt of the impact, it wasn't without consequence. He slid down the wall, and small rocks came chasing, tumbling over him. He stood back up and popped his shoulder back in by slamming it into the wall. He spewed a little bit of blood out of his mouth before wiping it away. The section of his shield he needed to perform those actions automatically did so without a moment's hesitation.
You've taken a lot of damage, Vance. My systems won't last much longer at this rate, with no stable energy supply. You will be without my assistance very soon.
Fantastic. The fairy was about to charge Vance again, but this time Leon was already next to it and jumped up, grabbing onto the hilt of his dagger still lodged into the fairy's back. Hope, deafen me, Leon told her, to prevent the shriek from interrupting him. Hope enforced the shielding near both Leon and Vance's ears to block out any external sound waves. Let's see how you like this, you hideous fuck, Leon said, letting all of his energy flow out from his body and into the dagger, using it as a lightning rod. The overflowing energy caused discharge to spark off both the dagger and Leon's hands. The fairy let out a shrill shriek, and its body language told them both enough without being able to hear its cry. Even with the pain and convulsing, the fairy powered through. Its arm twisted in a double-jointed manner and turned almost completely around, allowing it to grab Leon by the legs and ripping him from its back along with the dagger. Vance saw this and charged to help him, but the fairy met him halfway, sweeping him up quickly with its other hand. The fairy zipped around the cave at insane speeds with both of them in each hand. It held them by their ankles. Leon stabbed it a couple of times, but this only caused it to move at a faster speed, pinning him in the air behind it with the G-force. Finally, it stopped. Its teeth were grinding back and forth, chattering as it fluttered there looking at its two catches. Hope had switched the shields back already to completely focus on physical defense, enabling the two men to hear the creature's words.
Use no favorite toys. Fine. Very fine.
It said as it stuttered and smiled. Vance, still dazed from the intense movements earlier, struggled trying to even reach up to its hand. He finally managed to get up, but it was of no use as he didn't have the strength to pry it open. The fairy continued to smile for a bit, but eventually frowned.
Me bored. Want rest. You go sleep now,
the fairy said as it began to squeeze their legs harder. It took them to the nearby cave wall and began to slam them against it. Boom, boom, boom. Each time seemed more intense than the previous one. Their heads and upper torsos were pounding into the nearby wall. Leon's shields were still holding up thanks to his conquest, but even so, the impact alone was even hard on him. It felt like he was wearing a football helmet and having his helmet hit by a heavy hitter like Babe Ruth with a metal bat, while at the same time Mike Tyson slammed his upper body over and over.
Vance, my systems are going to shut down for you in a moment. I've absorbed what I could for you with my reserves and...
Hope paused.
It seems my other fragment is offline, including all of Vance's defensive systems,
she told Leon. He really wasn't able to understand much of what she said, as his head felt like it was going to implode on him at any time. The fairy paused a moment and looked at Vance, who wasn't feeling any better than Leon.
You're different,
it said, smelling up and down on him. Eventually, it took its long, slender tongue and licked him.
You feel now like other toys. Taste same too. Why you still feel new? And you feel like old toy?
It asked, looking from Vance to Leon and then back again. I don't know, Vance said, barely able to speak coherently. The fairy tossed him up and then caught him by the head, gently placing Vance's face against the rock wall. Slowly, with an admirable amount of pressure, it scraped his face against some nearby jagged rocks. It was more than enough to break the skin of his fortified body and caused Vance to moan from the pain. The fairy looked at him oddly as blood dripped from his face onto the fairy's slick fingers. This caused shock and appeasement all at once to appear upon its face.
This good,
it said, smiling.
Now you sleep.
With Vance still held tightly, it arched its arm back from its body as if it had no shoulder joint. Close your eyes, Vance told Leon as he tossed something up in the fairy's face. The dark fairy, who knew only secluded darkness, was now blinded by a flashbang. It dropped the two of them and shrieked, flying high into the ceiling. You okay, kid? I'll be fine. What about you? You're not looking so well. I'll be fine, but we need to figure out something to end this. You cheat! The fairy roared, slowly recovering from the blast. You use something else! Just as the fairy was about to charge in again, someone yelled from the other side of the cave. That's enough! The fairy looked back, cocking its head back like that of a battered crow to see who it was. A surprised look rushed across its face as it realized who was there. Hey, you! I trade you for a new toy! Why back? The witch gave him his answer with a spell. The fairy looked at her oddly. Finally, something happened. And it didn't shriek this time, but instead began to scream out in complete anguish. It hit its face multiple times and flew into the wall, bashing its head against the rock before eventually it became engulfed in flames. Why? Why? It screamed, flying through the tainted waters trying to put itself out. The waters had no effect on the flames, as they continued to spread across its horrid body, continuing to burn. The slime upon its arms acted like grease, and the flames moved everywhere as the water mixed with the slime spread across its body. Its disgusting slimy hands turned into a flaky, crispy layer, and the rest of it welted and blistered. Finally, its screams became a whisper, and eventually nothing else came from it, as it fell down into the water and laid still burning. Its wings were now nothing more than a cloud of powdery dust that floated in the air even as they had departed from the fairy, who was now motionless, dead in the water. Let's go, we don't have much time, the girl told them. Leon, who was still dazed lying in the water, got a closer look and saw that it was the witch who was taken away not long ago by the man named Valentine. Both he and Vance struggled as they climbed to their feet. They just looked strangely at her. How did you escape? Leon asked her, wondering after having been warned so earnestly by Vance about Valentine. There's no time to explain. It won't be long until they catch up. I have to get you to Fate. We'll be safe once we get to the dead zone. The two agreed to forgo an explanation for now, as they moved to grab their packs that were still nearby from where they entered. Hurry up, the witch said, motioning them to follow her to the edge of the fairy's toy box. Don't tell me it's in there, Leon said, looking a bit disgusted at the litter of body parts and grime around the entrance. The reason the creature was created was likely to prevent anyone from entering the dead zone. It only makes sense to have it defend the very spot the entrance is at, the witch said, looking at Leon before pushing through the waterfall alone. We were just thrown into a pool of blood, shit, and who knows what else. I'm pretty sure you even inhaled some of it. And you're worried about what's behind this? Vance asked, as he quickly was dressing the wound on his face with some supplies from his pack. The wound was deep, and it stretched from his upper right lip to his eyebrow. What was that strange voice that came from the fairy, Vance? I'm not too sure, kid. I just know that it spooked me and was more than we would have been equipped to handle. Anyway, let's go, he said after he quickly finished dressing the wound. He tossed some bloodied rags he used to clean the wound to the side and began to push forward after first nudging Leon. Together, they had entered into the waterfall. Part 5. The fresh water from above washed over them, cleansing each of them as they pushed through the waterfall. It was a refreshing change from the filth that they had endured previously. The waters within the cave that they had been forced into repeatedly were at least as bad as an unmaintained sewage system. Once past the water,
They took a deep breath to try and relax and clear their minds. The air they took in wasn't anything fresh. Gagging, they wiped away the water from their eyes as multiple corpses of many of the same people filled their vision. Some bodies were complete, others distorted and partial, from the terrible flame the fairy had given to them time and time again. The bodies laid and hung all around them in this graveyard aisle. Other than the multiple corpses on the aisle, there was only a massive dead hangman's tree. The tree itself was practically littered with bodies. Beside that was a suspicious-looking stone-pillared doorway that stood a few feet away from it. The middle-aged witch had already pushed through the field of corpses and was at the center of the aisle awaiting them. She stood next to the stone pillar door that had a faint glow coming from within it within Roman numeral 8 on the top section. The entrance ahead looked eerily similar to what a section of Stonehenge might look like alone. Leon chose to focus on that aspect as he slowly passed by the corpses. Each step was taken with the utmost care, and when he was able, he did his best not to disturb the rotten graveyard.
Let's go fast, the witch told them. You don't want to be late for your appointment.
Is it safe? Vance asked. He looked at the curious glow moving his fingers around the rim of the entrance. He knew that if the enemy could have entered before, they would more than likely have done so rather than having this creature guard it.
It's safe for me and those fate are expecting, which is you. Go on, we don't have time for this.
Vance finally moved forward and passed through.
You're next. Let's move,
the witch told Leon, who was right nearby.
What do you think, Hope?
Leon asked her.
Well, it's oddly suspicious that she escaped, given who she was with, but you've also come all this way already. There's no point in second-guessing it when you're literally at the dead zone. We also don't know anything about this witch. She may have had some way to get away, and been waiting for you to show up before doing so.
Seems like more than that. She was able to kill the fairy that we struggled so much against together. Are all witches this powerful?
I'm sorry, but I'm not too certain about the strength of witches. In the past, they were considered powerful and did fight alongside conquest users and the gods in the Great War.
Leon didn't quite know what to think of this answer, but moved forward, passing through the stone entrance. There was a slight ringing and what sounded like someone yelling behind him in the distance. He couldn't tell if this was in his head or if someone was actually yelling at him. At this point, it didn't matter as he had walked through the stone doorway and the ringing had stopped. He was now staring at what was known as the dead zone.